Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Cowslip Meadow. The Battle of Cowslip Meadow, fought in the year 34 of the Common Reckoning, was the climax of the war known as the Strife of the Skeldings. The battle was fought between the forces of Thortan, which were led into battle by his uncle Thognar, and those of Aldgar. The throne of the Skeldings had been bequeathed to Thortan by Skeld the Stormblown, who, on his deathbed, in front of many witnesses, had declared Thortan to be his heir. However, many of the captains of the Skeldings had refused to accept Thortan as their king. These rebels insisted that it was not for the monarch to name his successor, but that the captains of the Skeldings should do so, and they had selected Aldgar, who was one of their number, to that role. Aldgar's army had been raised from the households of the 30 or so rebel captains. Aldgar himself rode with a group of 50 or so cavalry, composed of those captains and their senior retainers, dressed in mail, carrying shields, and armed with spears. There were also about 100 spearmen, clad in gambeson and bearing shields, and another 100 or so unarmoured light infantry, each of whom held a shield with his left hand, 2 javelins in his right, and wore a sword at his side. Finally, there were approximately 100 unarmoured archers. The army led by Thognar was of a similar size. Thognar fought on foot, alongside the 60 men of the king's guard, clad in mail and bearing shields and spears. The remainder of his army consisted of troops that had been levied from the households that were loyal to Thortan. These tended to be households of relatively recent origin, and so less wealthy than the well-established households that supported Aldgar. There were a further 120 spearmen, with shields but no armour, and around 100 archers. There were also about 60 cavalry, wearing gambeson and carrying shields, and armed with javelins and swords. Aldgar's strategy was simple. He intended to strike hard and quickly at the centre of royal power, the great hall of Skeld, before Thortan could gather his strength. He therefore marched his men through the fertile farmlands by the banks of the Silver Stream, straight toward this objective. Thortan preferred drinking to fighting, and had therefore delegated command of the conflict to Thognar. Now, while the bulk of the Skeldings were indifferent to Thortan, who they regarded as a dissolute but harmless wastrel, they loathed Thognar, and Thognar was well aware of this. He knew that, unless the rebellion was put down swiftly and decisively, he would see the rebels increasing in number, while support for Thortan and himself dwindled. He therefore marched his forces out to intercept those of Aldgar. The two armies met as they marched onto opposite sides of a grassy pasture known as Cowslip Meadow. Directly between them was a small patch of woodland, flanked by 2 small hills, each crowned with more trees. Aldgar reacted first. He ordered his archers forward to take up position in the central woodland and cover the advance of his remaining forces. Seeing Aldgar's archers taking up a strong central position, Thognar decided to attack on the flank. His archers moved forward on his left, and he ordered his cavalry even further left to try and get behind Aldgar's forces. Aldgar responded by leading his cavalry forward on the other flank, while his spearmen and light infantry came up behind. Thognar's archers continued to move forward to the base of the hill on their left, from where they started to loose arrows into the right flank of Aldgar's archers, who shot back as best they could. Both sides suffered some casualties in this exchange. As Aldgar's light infantry moved up behind his cavalry, his archers moved around the edge of the forest to bring more bows to bear on Thognar's archers. The archery exchange continued. Aldgar's men were concealed among the trees and so difficult to hit, while Thognar's men were in the open and suffered more grievously, being eliminated as a fighting force. Aldgar now pushed his cavalry even further forward on his left flank, bringing his light infantry forward to line up behind them, with the wood to their right. On the other side of the woods, having eliminated the threat posed by Thognar's archers, Aldgar was also able to bring his spearmen forward. Thognar's levy spearmen advanced into Aldgar's cavalry, who withdrew. Meanwhile, Thognar's cavalry had ridden around the back of the hill on Aldgar's right flank, to within javelin range of the right flank of Aldgar's spearmen. However, their javelins had little impact. Thognar and the royal guard also advanced. Aldgar's remaining archers loosed several volleys of arrows, directing these specifically at Thognar and the men around him. One of these arrows struck Thognar in the face, sorely wounding him. A group of the royal guard charged the archers and drove them back through the forest. The royal guard then regrouped and, carrying the now semi-conscious Thognar along with them, charged into Aldgar's spearmen. On Thognar's right, his levy spearmen charged Aldgar's light infantry. Although the light infantry rained javelins upon their attackers, the spearmen were not deterred and crashed into the light infantry, cutting most of them down. The remainder reeled back, closely pursued by a group of spearmen. On his left, Thognar's men also had some success, pushing back some of Aldgar's spearmen. But Thognar's cavalry did not engage hand-to-hand with the remainder, fearing to come within the reach of their spears, and continued to limit themselves to ineffectively hurling javelins at their foes. Aldgar's spearmen were thus able to regroup and fell upon the royal guard. As their numbers diminished, the remaining royal guardsmen clustered around Thognar, who had collapsed upon the ground. Aldgar's archers loosed arrows at those of Thognar's levy spearmen who were not in pursuit of the fleeing remnants of Aldgar's light infantry. The arrows only served to annoy the spearmen, who charged the archers. The archers responded by running away. The levy spearmen, who had been in pursuit of the light infantry, now reappeared on the scene, charging Aldgar and the horsemen around him. Although the left flank of his army had evaporated around him, Aldgar and his cavalry were now behind Thognar's troops. He spurred his horse away from the charging spearmen. His cavalrymen regrouped around him, and together they galloped away from the battle toward the great hall of Skeld. Even as Aldgar galloped from the field, his spearmen once again charged into the remnants of the royal guard. The royal guard fought desperately, throwing some of their attackers back, but ultimately weight of numbers overwhelmed them, and the remaining royal guardsmen were slaughtered as they stood over the now lifeless body of Thognar. Thognar's cavalry had stood by and watched as the royal guard was annihilated, but seeing Aldgar's spearmen joyously mutilating Thognar's corpse roused them from their inaction. These men had thrown their lot in with Thortan in the hope of taking the lands and titles of Aldgar's captains. They knew that the great hall of Skeld was undefended, its only occupants being the carousing Thortan and his drunken companions. If Aldgar won the throne, they could expect no mercy. They spurred their horses after Aldgar and his companions and rode them down. In the ensuing cavalry melee, Aldgar was struck down by a sword stroke and his life and his reign were ended. But the rebel captains avenged him. Not one of Thognar's horsemen survived. Leaving the battlefield behind them, the rebel captains then rode on to the great hall of Skeld, where they made short work of the drunken Thortan. Thus ended the battle of Cowslip Meadow, and thus ended the strife of the Skeldings.